Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come here because I feel I'm among friends. This topic of transformation and what should leaders be is very distorted by the economic crisis. So a lot of people who ask me these days to give talks say, you know, what can you say to leaders and to organization development professionals and to human resource people about what they should do about this economic crisis? And the reason I chose this particular title is because, in my view, there are even more important things going on than the economic crisis. So this title, What Else is Going On, was brought home to me by one of several stories. And I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and you will see from the first story why this title is so important. It has to do with one of the things leaders, organization development people, HR professionals, managers, I now lump them all together, do have to learn to be more mindful. So the first story is the one that really brought that home to me. It concerned a trip to the hospital with my, at that time, 4-year-old granddaughter. We were at Cape Cod. She had cut her head on a glass table. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. We tried to get to a local medical facility to see whether they could stitch up her head. The nearest thing was the hospital in Hyannis, which was an hour and a half away. My son, his wife, and the other daughter, and my wife tried to figure out what to do. Well, we have to go to the hospital. So at 8 o'clock, we took the 4-year-old and my son and my wife, and we got in the car, and we drove for an hour and a half to this hospital. And there we had to wait. We waited over an hour and finally saw a doctor, and he looked at it and stitched it up, and everything was fine. He approved that we came to the hospital. And then another hour and a half home. By the time we got home and finally got to bed, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and we felt, you know, what a horrible experience. The next morning, I met a friend who's a Harvard psychologist. She's a well-known professor. You may have read some of her books. She writes about mindfulness, what we pay attention to. And we were meeting at the tennis courts, and she said, how are things going? And we said, oh, we had this awful experience last night. You know, my granddaughter cut her head, and we had 3 hours to the hospital, and the doctors weren't there, and so on. And she listened to all this, listened to our tale of woe. And what she said was, first of all, you know, you Americans, referring to herself as well, it should be we Americans, we judge everything immediately. Things are good or bad. And think about last night and ask yourself what else was going on during that trip to the hospital and the wait and the trip home. And you know, that was a transformational question for me. Truly, because instead of asking, you know, how come we had such bad luck to have such an awful experience with this grandchild and all this dead time, we started to think about what else had actually gone on. We had spent an hour and a half on the way to the hospital with this hurt child in not crying, instead being actually quite a delightful little girl. And here was my wife and my son and I with our 4-year-old having little conversations, getting to know her. Then in the hospital we noticed how interested she was in everything. She was not upset as much as we were. And then on the way home She was again very